The earth rumbles as the hooves of 100,000 horses march forward. An indomitable horde crests the horizon, the Huns. Behind them, a trail of death and destruction. But who are they? Where did they come from, and what do they want? Well, we'll find that out for you guys. I'm Ashton Myers, joined today by Riley Osborne, my co-host, and this is Human Histories. Thanks for tuning in, and Riley will talk to you guys real quick about how you can support the show, and we'll hop right into who this mysterious group of people were.
Yep, a couple quick ways to support the show. First off, listen to the show, but also follow us on Human Histories Podcast and all of our socials. That's Instagram, Twitter, Facebook for upcoming news on the episodes, Patreon for any support, and also go to humanhistoriespodcast@gmail.com and shoot us some emails, guys. We want this to be a community. We want this to be a place where people can have a conversation about history. And shoot us those emails and we'll do answer podcasts. We'll get back to you, and we just want to make sure that everyone feels like, they're an important part of this thing. That's the best way to support us, honestly.
So, the Huns were a group of nomads, and if you've been living under a rock and you don't know what nomads are, they wander. They go from place to place. Maybe they have some agriculture, but it's seasonal. The long story short, they don't set roots like a civilization like the Sassanids or the Greeks would. They go to and from, and most empires at the time, or already established civilizations, would have considered a culture like this barbarian. But we need to ask, were they really barbarians? The use of the term barbarians as a classification is often seen as a negative generalization, to be less civilized or primitive. And this may not have been the case, but what it often came down to was the fact that you had elites, maybe not elites, but elitists within those empires, the Romans especially, who looked down upon these cultures due to the lack of societal organization outside of a simple hierarchy and religion. And a brief note, it's very easy for us to hold this view when we're observing history from the present, as our primary sources were written by those who already had those established institutions, who had written history, who had more than simply oral tradition. And does that make them better then? And does that make the barbarians, air quotes, barbarians, less than? Or does it simply make them different? Because we know for a fact that it did not make them any less formidable. But anyway, the Huns were a group of nomads who originated, we suspect, they maybe not have originated, but they were present in the area of the Caucasus, which was the border between Europe and Asia. And, with the fate of history, regarding antiquity, we can't really know for sure. We have a general idea, but there's a lot of gray area, and we need to do our best to plug in the gaps. Thus is the fate of antiquity. Riley's going to talk to you guys real quick about who we suspect they may have been, but even this is, speculative.
Yeah, talking about nomadic people that didn't really write or build any long-standing structures or cultural monuments, it can become really difficult to trace down their origins. But we have some speculations. We have some legitimate information that could give us an idea of where the Huns came from. It's interesting. We'll get to a bit later, but when you read about the Huns, it's often said that they appeared in, and then it doesn't give any more detail than they appeared to the Romans at a certain time, because that's when historical data of them really starts. But we have some indications of that they could have come from a group in modern-day Mongolia called the Xiongnu, which were also a nomadic tribe from about the 3rd century BC to the late 1st century AD. And some of the reasons that we have belief that it could have been them is actually some Chinese historians have translated Xiongnu to be Huna or Hun. So it could have been the same name. Does this mean that they were from the Xiongnu? Honestly, no. It's a bit of a stretch really to say. I think that it's historians sort of grasping at straws. We have to remember that Mongolia is by no means close to where the Huns first started being noticed, which was near modern-day Kazakhstan. And Ashton, deliberate a little bit on what they were doing when they were in the Kazakh area.
Well, before we get there, I'll just briefly mention that, as Riley mentioned, there was Chinese historians who had looked at I'm not sure, I'm not a Chinese historian, the syllables of the what the Xiongnu would have been pronounced as. And yes, it was Hun. And at the same time, while the Xiongnu were active, this is where a wrench kind of gets thrown into the works, is Tacitus, a Roman historian, had noticed this group of people, like Riley said, in Kazakhstan on the western edge near the Caspian Sea. So the comparison between the two, it's our best lead, but it's still tenuous at best, as there's yet to be any convincing evidence found. And what we have found is seemingly pointed the opposite way. Now, to give you guys an example, in the 1930s, there were artifacts found in present-day Mongolia located in the Ordos Desert, which was inner Mongolia, so pretty far away from the Caspian Sea, right? West of the Great Wall, which would indicate that the Xiongnu were a nomadic group that was harassing the Chinese, right? And these artifacts depicted wondrous mythical creatures and other unique, interesting art styles, which unfortunately happened to be uncharacteristic of anything found of the Huns during the point at which they were most active, which would have been the 4th and 5th century AD. The Xiongnu had been around since the 4th century BC, so that's a difference of 800 or 900 years, depending on which figure you choose. And given that, some scholars believe that the Huns simply originated in Kazakhstan and moved west from there as a distinct culture.
Yeah, people forget that the world's a big place, and a lot of cultures were nomadic. It's totally understandable that they were just in Kazakhstan and maybe even heard about the Xiongnu and inherited the name. We don't really know. We can't really track that down definitively. But now that we sort of know where they came from, allegedly, and in a general idea, let's talk about where they were going. And
before we do that, I do want to mention that part of the reason why this gets so messy is because the historians who first documented the Huns happened to be European. His name eludes me, but he was a French historian in the 18th century. And so, naturally, they're going to want to glorify the West and put down the barbarous East, right? So it makes sense, because for the Huns to have originated simply in Kazakhstan and not been Xiongnu, which were north of China, so a great deal further away, it gets rid of the idea, the archetype of the East versus West invader, that permeated this time of history, from the Persians coming to Greece, or from now the Huns coming to Rome. It was a favorite of the early 19th and 20th century historians. They propagated this belief, and unfortunately it led to them having a bias against these people, which, we lose a lot when that occurs, because now we don't have objectivity in history. And that's going to be an important thing to remember throughout this episode. And Riley and I will be stressing that over and over, how important objectivity is when looking at a group like the Huns, because by all accounts from the Romans, they seem like, like they're going to come and butcher your children in the middle of the night and eat your dog in front of you. But that's not quite the case, right? They were like I said in previous, they simply just had a different organizational structure that didn't make them less than or better than the Romans and surrounding empires.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that a bit more in detail later on, because we want to make sure to bring everyone back to earth when we talk about the Huns. It's nice in pop culture to see them as this faceless enemy, but in reality, this is a culture of people, and as all cultures, they're diverse, and they have their own traditions and their own important beliefs, and we're going to dive into that, right? And as I was saying, is where are they going to go? Where do all roads lead, right? To Rome. The Huns were well on their way to terrorize all of Europe, but before we skip ahead to 370 AD, let's talk a bit more about who they are, and we're going to start that with what religion they practiced. What did they believe?
So the Huns, you guys are going to hear this a lot in this episode. You're going to hear this a lot when we talk about history of antiquity, and that's the word allegedly, right? So keep that in mind, and if you don't know it, you should look it up now, and you should keep that in the back of your head throughout this episode. So allegedly, they believed something called Tangrinism, right? And there's no solid evidence, but, a group of people who live on the Eurasian steppe, they're in grasslands, they're under great big beautiful skies and tons of plains. So it's natural that they would worship the sky god. That was Tangris, right? He was a god of the sky. And an interesting note that I personally find it funny, because I'm an amateur historian, so it's simply just interesting to me, but it's one that might make a legitimate historian, pull his hair out. And that is the earliest known mentions of Tangrinism as a faith were by, You guessed it, this Yongnu, as far back as the 4th century BC. And that was a great deal, like I mentioned, a great deal of time before the Huns entered Europe, but it lends to the hypotheses that maybe they were the same people and split up, or maybe they were the same people and just simply changed their, they had a rebranding. Their PR firm was like, boys, like, this isn't it. Like, we gotta fix this, But as Riley alluded to earlier, it's not significant to say that nomadic tribes might wander and come into contact with one another and as a result share their faiths and what have you, right? Now, at the time, unlike Christianity or Islam, the religion, Tangranism, would have been viewed as pagan. So the Romans at this point were, primarily all Christian, right? And the empire was predominantly Christian. So, and when we know how Christians view pagans, just skip ahead 600 years to the Vikings and the Saxons and Franks, right?
Well, I mean, don't skip ahead at all, right? The Romans were killing pagans in the Colosseum at that time. They were already being pretty negative towards people that didn't have the same beliefs as them. Just to expand a little bit on Tangranism, we're not saying definitively that this is the religion that they practiced, but we are saying that if it wasn't Tangranism itself, it was probably something that was pretty similar to it, right? And so I was reading that they whether it was the sky god or other gods, and it was either it had something to do with Tangranism or it had something to do with nature, with the wind, with the snow, with the sun. So unsurprisingly, a nomadic people that spends most of their time walking through, wide open landscapes or living in the foots of mountains and stuff like that would worship the earth. It's not surprising, and it's definitely a interesting look at what they would have believed.
And those two tenets of what they would believe, that these were, you could view them as, they were systems of belief, but they were not quite religions, right? A good example would be today how I can't speak for Riley, I can speak for myself. I'm not typically a religious man. I'm certainly spiritual, right? So I don't have an organized deity or institution that I pledge myself to, but I have my own personal beliefs. And, believe it or not, some of them actually, maybe I would have been a Hun because they kind of line up a little bit. But these two beliefs, first was animism. And now animism, you can think of the etymology, which is the history of that word. What does animism sound like? It sounds like animate, right? And to animate means give life, right? So animism was the belief that all extant, and meaning existing, not just alive. So the rock and, the trees, and where they had a spirit. Whether that was wind or rocks or animals or words, it had a spirit or some animating essence, something that allowed it to exist in this world, right? And next was, unsurprisingly for this time, shamanism. And shamanism is interesting because not only was it a belief, but it was a practice. So shamanism standalone could be considered more of a religion because there's a lot more customs involved and a lot more practices involved, and it's not so much just what we believe. And shamans believe that there were multiple planes of existence, and in these planes of existence inhabited both benevolent and malicious spirits, and that through altered states of consciousness and trance, the shamans might be able to affect the corporeal, which is physical, plane. Think the shamans in the rainforest in South America taking ayahuasca and whatnot, right? They would do this in the form, for the purpose of healing and other rituals, but primarily for the Huns, and you guys will see this eventually when we get to Attila. They practice rituals involving divination and soothsaying, and both of those are essentially just different ways of trying to gain an understanding of the future or of prophecy, right? The omens, you see a crow fly over a battlefield and you think, oh, this is going to be our day, because maybe you worship some deity that resembles a crow, right? That's a stretch, and I'm talking out of my ass, but nonetheless. And I mean, personally, if you asked me, the religion sounds like one of profound respect and adherence to the natural order of the world, which, we'll see later on. This could potentially be a justification that the Huns used for themselves in their conquest for their ruthlessness. Their acts were only in accordance with their nature, and they were well accustomed to the cruel reality of nature, so by extension, it doesn't seem that their actions themselves would be too cruel.
Yeah, and I think that it's right away we're already straying away from the picture that was painted of these guys being this ruthless barbarian horde that didn't have any sort of structure to it. And the only real we have some Roman historians that have said, Jordanus specifically, he said, oh, the Huns don't practice any religion. But that doesn't stand up to really any sort of level of scrutiny. Almost all cultures were dealing with some sort of belief at the time. And the Huns, being nomads, would have been interacting with different people from different cultures all the time. And they would have been enveloping people into their groups as they went along. At this time, we're still dealing with the Huns as a sort of amalgamation of tribes and groups. They're not under one ruler yet. So it's really important to note that they definitely would have had some sort of religious belief. I can't understand how they wouldn't have. And it's even noted later that while they were working under the Romans, that they did some ceremonies before going into battle. So if they don't believe in any spirituality or any deities, who are they doing ceremonies to? It doesn't add up. So I think that these are definitely some good guidelines as to what they believed religiously.
Yeah, and bear in mind, these are also humans, right? And we're going to get a little, this is one of our tangents coming at you live from Ashton Myers. And, maybe I'm a meathead, Riley's a meathead. We both love Muay Thai, martial arts, lifting, right? Like, we're contrary to what it might sound. And maybe you're at the gym and you see this just yoked dude and he comes up to you and he's got his protein shake while he's lifting, and you're at gym A, right? And he says to you, he's like, bro, you got to have your protein while you're working out. Otherwise you're not going to make gains. And you're new to this, right? Maybe you just encountered this guy. So then all of a sudden you grab this protein drink and you start drinking it and you're making gains. And, maybe you're making gains and you think it's because of the protein and not because of your lifting, right? And then you go to another gym. So you're a nomad, you're a gym nomad, and you go to another gym and you realize, hey, nobody here is drinking protein shakes. They're not going to make any gains, right? So then you start telling everybody, hey, this is, you got to drink a protein shake to help you make gains. And then they go on to spread that, and they go on to spread that. So it's incredibly unlikely for a group of nomads that have interactions with so many different groups of people as they're traveling around to not have any kind of, building upon what Riley said, to not have any system of belief whatsoever, especially, again, like he said, when it's documented that they did, right? So it kind of seems unbased for people to claim they didn't. And now there's not much more to say about Tangranism, as this isn't history of religions as much as it is human histories, and it's not the focal point of this episode. But we'll leave you guys with a brief last note on Tangranism that might help in our understanding of the fearlessness the Huns possessed, both in warfare and in the face of death. And this is a quote from what would be considered their holy book. When the blue sky, Tangri, above and the brown earth below were created, between them a human being was created. Tangri creates death. Human beings have all been created in order to die. You passed away, and by passed away they mean went flying because he was a sky god, until Tangri gives you life again, which, maybe that supposes that they, number one, they didn't fear death because they understood the purpose of it. They understand the necessity of it. And that's, I personally, I think that's inspiring. Because they were evidently very in accordance with nature. They saw the change of the seasons. They saw the, kind of much like the Native Americans, right? Like how they were outside and they were involved in nature, and they just had that deep, profound respect for it. They were a part of it, and they didn't recognize themselves as separate from it as much as maybe just a conscious observer of it, right? And you'd see how that might help you going into battle when, that last line, until Tangri gives you life again. And if that's what you believe, then, death is nothing to fear because it's simply a doorway, to quote my man Gandalf. But Riley's gonna get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty of the Huns, and I find this super interesting. So I hope you guys will too.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about everything about how they operated, right? And what's the building block of every society? It's their economy. How are they surviving? How are they making profit or making ends meet? Getting food. And there's a common belief with the Huns that they didn't practice agriculture at all, and that they were like strictly nomadic and they were always moving around. And there's been recent evidence that challenges that. And it's now believed that they practiced agropastoralism, which is it's also called like mini nomadism. Like it's half nomadic, like to not blow up your brain with a big word there.
Gnome nomads.
Yeah, exactly. But it means that they're a mix of nomads and farmers. And if you're unaware, like the regions that they're living in get cold in the winter, right? These young knew if that's where they came from, they definitely would have been dealing with some pretty cold winters, some pretty serious weather. And even in Kazakhstan and then as they headed north, they would have been dealing with legitimate weather problems. So in the summer, they would move their herds and themselves to different pastures, and they would graze these pastures. But in the winter, they would go back to areas that were consistently built up and consistently had some people living there permanently. And that's where they would store their animals and themselves over the winter. So they would have sort of built up areas, not necessarily permanent built up areas like Roman cities or anything, but more built up areas that were there mostly permanently. There would have been farmers that were working them year round. And then the majority of them would move around during the summer.
And, you know, like if you've ever seen pictures of like early, like I know they're not Mongolian as far as we know, but that's on near the same latitude. And if you've ever seen pictures of Mongolians from the early 1800s and 1900s, before, you know, there was houses and electricity everywhere, you see the great big leather and fur coats that they have on, protecting their faces in winter. And like Riley said, it's not a city, but it's essentially, in a sense, it is a city of tents, right? It's a city of tents and farms and whatnot. And it makes sense for a group that likes to travel, right? Personally, if I was the Huns, I just would have like went down and ravaged Greece or something, you know, wintered in like Macedon instead of staying in the Eurasian steppe. But yeah, that's besides the point.
Yeah. And what are they eating? You know, how are they feeding themselves? The Huns relied heavily on their cattle and goats. But they also had, and this last part isn't talked about that much, but they had these massive herds of sheep. And it was said that the sheep were as important to them as their horses, because what are they getting from their sheep, right? They're getting a consistent supply of wool, and they can make clothing with that wool. But what's crazy is, I was reading, and I'm back to speculating now, is they would not only eat their horses as well, the worse off horses, the horses that weren't as useful to them as war horses, but they would sometimes make milk and cheese out of mare's milk, like horse milk and cheese. So they were very good at making use of what they had and making sure that the herds that they were using could sustain them throughout the year. This also shows that they clearly had a mostly meat diet, so they got most of their food from animals and animal product. And something else they did was the Huns, they obtained valuable resources from sometimes trading their horses and the products they would be able to make with their sheep, but also raiding. So it's something that we see a lot of cultures doing, where raiding is actually a primary source of income. You know, probably the most famous example would be the Vikings. That's the example that I can think of most. But it shows that there's a level of humanity within the Huns where, in history, when we're talking about people in 300 AD and 400 AD, these people didn't have a globalist view of morality. They didn't have we have to keep care of everyone. They had a we have to keep care of us and our people. So for them, the economics of raiding and getting supplies by raiding other neighboring countries and people, this wasn't morally bad to them. This was just a means of making ends meet. This was how they operated.
It wasn't personal.
It wasn't personal. It was business. And it just so happened to be bloody business. And the Huns, you know, we're still in the early stages of the Huns now during this podcast, but as we'll see later, they get really good at it. They get really good at milking their neighbors without destroying them. They're very, very good at this. So it becomes clear that whereas they used intimidation tactics and they definitely used brutality, this was an important part of their economy. And without raiding, they didn't have the ability to make a lot of money. They had to use their muscle to really fuel their economy.
I think that's. I want to know your opinion on this, because personally, like when you compare the Roman perception of the Huns to what would be an objective perception of the Huns, you might say that like they should struggle more, right? They don't have established cities, they don't have established networks of food and whatnot, but yet somehow they get by providing for like everybody in their group, right? Everybody in their tribe or everybody in their collective, right? And I personally like comparing that to some already established civilizations where, you know, what happens is you get that bureaucratic bloat, and then the elites get all the, you know, the trickle down doesn't happen, and the people at the bottom don't get taken care of when they should. But then you have the Huns who are just going from place to place, and yet they're succeeding, right? Like again, that kind of makes the argument that how are these people less than, right? Like they're obviously winning in a way that other cultures just can't fathom, right? And like you said, like they got so damn good at like taking just the right amount of resources to keep that other civilization or culture or opposing force alive. where they could, move to, like, they could be on a rotation. They could go to culture A in year 1, and then culture B in year 2, and then culture C in year 3, and then culture D in year 4, and then after year 4, like, hey, look at culture A's doing pretty well. They go back.
Circle back around. Yeah, and it's interesting. We cannot use modern morality to look at history legitimately. That's completely ridiculous. You're never gonna have a good view of history if you do that. So I think it's funny, to call here's an example. To call the Huns barbarians it would be the same thing as calling the Native Americans of North America savages, right? Just because they were different, when in reality they were a detailed and distinct culture that had a lot of great things that they were doing for themselves and their own people.
And you'd have them...
No, sorry. Continue. Go for it.
And you'd have them being called barbarians by people like the Romans, who within their military practiced something called decimation.
So that's what I was about to say. Yeah. I was literally going to say, like, if the Huns could write, sorry, not if the Huns, but let's say if the Gauls in earlier Rome, if the Gauls that Caesar took over could have written down what happened to them, do you think they would write highly of the Romans? Oh, the Romans came and politely raped everyone here. Like, no, the Romans were just as barbaric as the Huns were. There's really a very small difference between the two, but it's just one side is actually writing down history. Last week we said history is written by the victor. This week we're going to say history is written by whoever's writing and is taking, like, legitimate notes and keeping them. The Huns aren't writing their own history. So it's really hard to get an accurate lens of what they're doing and how they're perceiving themselves. I rarely believe in good versus evil in history, and I think there's only a few examples of it that you can look at. And I think that for the most part, you have to understand that good and evil is very much so in the eye of whoever stuff is happening to. Is it good for the Huns to let their people starve to death? Is that good? So these are questions that don't add up when we think about modern history, modern morality, and they don't add up when we think of ourselves, right?
Bringing it back to what you said about the Romans and Gaul, like, it could easily be argued that what Julius Caesar enacted, and I'm a big fan of Julius Caesar in the sense that he accomplished an incredible amount of things, but what he enacted in Gaul was nothing short of a Holocaust. Right. And not only that, but within the Roman ranks, just to enforce discipline, maybe your buddy who, you fought with for 15 years is sitting beside you and he's it's his unlucky day and your unit has been lacking discipline. The Roman commanders would kill 1 out of every 10th man in a legion to enforce discipline. Like, is that, and you're going to tell me that the Huns were barbaric.
And
right?
They would have the other 9 do it.
Yeah.
So they were killing their own friends. That didn't happen that many times in Roman history, but it happened. So yeah, I don't buy for a second that the Romans were culturally superior and much more lenient and forgiving than the Huns were. No, people were barbaric at this time, period, and it wasn't necessarily good or evil. But let's dive back to the Huns. Let's keep telling this story. And the next part is we're going to talk about their horses. You can't talk about the Huns without talking about their horses. I think that that's an impossible thing to talk about. I like to think about the Huns and their horses like bikers and their motorcycles. You know what I mean? These guys lived on their horses. It's said that they were glued to their horses, having meetings, eating, doing everything they could from horseback. And I think that it probably was a cultural, bravado around the horsemanship, being able to ride and being able to shoot accurately from your horseback. And it's cool. They use these specific saddles that the rest of the Europeans weren't using, where they would have much more support on each side of the saddle, so that they were sort of like implanted inside their horse, and they couldn't get thrown off as easily. And this gave them a lot more stability with their bows. And the Huns were horse archers at a level that we'd never seen before. Their ability to shoot a bow was insane.
And you wouldn't see it again until the Mongols, right? Like 700 years later.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, I think that, to dive back just super quick, I think that a reason that we see these young new, like we see the Huns, is because the Mongolians were similar to the Huns in their conquest. So I think that could jade historians a little bit. That's why I think that they probably just came from Kazakhstan. But to get back, Sorry, you're going to say something on that?
Yeah, well, that's the unfortunate element of history, especially regarding nomads, is from the Caspian Sea, where it's suspected that where the Huns were spotted by Tacitus in 91 AD, all the way over to Inner Mongolia and beyond, right, north into Serbia and even south into parts of China. You have these groups of nomads who are all probably incredibly similar, but these dudes were like, bro, we don't care about literature. Like, let's go shoot some bows and eat some horse cheese.
Go milk a
we
horse.
miss out on exactly. Like we miss out on a lot of like the Huns, for all we know, maybe they weren't even the most formidable of the nomads, right? And look at what they did to Europe, right? So
yeah,
explains why a Great Wall was built by China.
It absolutely does, with the Tartars and all of them. But that's for a different podcast. And actually, if you're listening to this and you're however long we are into this and you're wondering if we're going to talk about Attila, this is our precursor. So come back next week. Because we really wanted to set the stage for the Huns, to tell you who these people are. Because I think that that's a story that's not told enough. And let's talk about their government. Let's talk about the way they organize themselves as people. Because as the Romans liked to say, they didn't organize themselves as people, which doesn't add up at all. And during the 4th century, it's believed that the Huns were this amalgamation of people. So they were groups of Huns, different groups of slightly different Hunnic people that...
Ethnicities were also varied immensely as well within,
pretty dramatically. And they had different leaders, and then that every once in a while they would sort of come together and unite, and they had a general sense of understanding, but they didn't have distinct leaders. So they knew who they were, but they had different tribal chieftains, you could say, or different kings, you could call it, whatever you want to call it. They had many leaders of different levels of authority that would all work together. And Ammianus wrote about the Huns having no kings and being led by primates, but he held the Huns in disdain, right? So that's a good example of Roman historians and their opinions on the Huns. But I'm just going to finish this. When I read primates, when I read, they're being led by primates, from a guy that had such a clear bias against the Huns, I actually see that as proof that the Huns had leadership. Because he sees this, bent over man, or he sees someone that he just holds in complete disdain, someone's leading them, and he sees it, and he writes it down. So someone's absolutely in charge.
Neither of us are scholars of Latin either, so if we say Ammianus or Ammianus or Ammianus, give us a little bit of a break. We're going to butcher some of these words. If you know how to pronounce it, please save us from ourselves.
Yeah.
All right, back to you, Riley.
English is my first and only language. I'm not going to apologize for not knowing how to pronounce Roman words from 2,000 years ago. But yeah, man, any help, honestly. Email us the breakdown of the syllables. So the first undisputed king and ruler of the Huns was Uldin, and after Uldin, the Huns then they'd have multiple co-rulers, and there was a couple occasions where they had 2 kings, but even when they had 2 kings, they still had many sub-kings or sub-leaders that would work with the kings in a sense of leadership. So they actually have, what's cool, and they talk about the Huns having meetings on horseback, and so they would form these rings, and to me, that's proof that the Huns had a distinct level of leadership that was able to expand across this massive empire. To assume that they were just barbarically, bashing around this huge empire and somehow getting together every once in a while is a bit ridiculous. They definitely had a distinct network of leadership.
And, to me, multiple co-rulers, 2 kings and, sub-leaders that, I hate to say it for fans of Rome out there, but that sounds a whole lot like consuls and governors. So
exactly. It's maybe a more rudimentary level of it, and they don't have these big, buildings where they have their Senate meetings, but they're absolutely intelligent
They're
people.
Organized.
Yeah, they're totally organized. And
that's why they were an empire. They weren't just a ragtag bunch of horsemen, right?
Yeah, at this time, it's important to note that the Hunnic Empire, already, before they've even really hit into Europe, they're almost the size of Rome. It's a huge empire they've already amassed at this time. And I wanted to talk about a couple cool traits about the Huns. And one of these things is they practiced artificial cranial deformation. And this was the sloping of the skull as a child. So when you're a child, you obviously have a soft, much more moldable head. And we don't know exactly how they did it. We do know that they did it because of archaeological digs and finding skulls that have these big deformed heads. It's said that they might have just tied really tightly around their head and left it like that. It's also said that they would like lie the baby down and like have like planks come on it like that. We're not really positive, but that aids to the level of fear that they would bring by looking distinctly different. Is that their skulls were literally deformed, tubular, right? And it said that it didn't cause any long-term damage. Who knows? Because it's not like it's not like we have modern doctors interviewing Huns being like, hey, how does your head feel? But for the most part, that was something about their culture, and it definitely aided to the belief that they were ugly and gross looking people.
Yeah, and like part and parcel with that, they this is actually something that could be supporting evidence for why they're not the Xiongnu. Xiongnu were reported as having long beards, right? But the Huns frequently would scar their faces. So right here on my cheek, where my half beard is, look at Riley, he's got a beautiful beard. They would scar that tissue, essentially disabling those people from being those men from being able to grow beards, right? So you could see as well why they were called primates and straight out of hell and whatnot by the Romans, because I mean when you've seen all kinds of different humans from Africa and Gaul and Spain and all these different places, and then you see these dudes with these tubular skulls and no facial hair, you're like yeah, like what are these like cone-headed baby men coming at me for? You know?
Oh man. Yeah, they would cut their face too, so they had scars all over their baby faces. Yeah. Yeah. And we touched briefly on the Hunnic archery, and I wanted to talk about that just for another quick second. You know, archery to the Huns, it wasn't a skill or an occupation. It was a way of life. Being a good archer was super important. You know, to give a more modern take, let's say you grew up in the UK or you grow up in Canada, to use us an example. You know, being good at hockey is an important thing to have as a young man. Well, the Huns aren't playing hockey. They're probably running around, shooting their bows and arrows, having competitions. You know, this is a level of manhood that you need to achieve to be a Hun, is to be a good archer. So they're able to use bows that most archers wouldn't have even been able to use. Just the level of weight that was used in these bows, because these guys have developed these muscles over their entire lives of shooting these bows. It's second nature to them. It's like taking 2 steps forward. You know, it's like walking to be able to shoot a bow. So most people, they could never get to that level. It's like we were talking about martial arts earlier. If you start martial arts when you're 5 versus if you start martial arts when you're 25, guess what? The guy who's 25 will never be as good as the 5-year-old, unless the 5-year-old's just awful genetically. But on average, if there was 100 of each, you know, the 5-year-olds would be leagues above the 25-year-olds. Just because I think it when it's cultural like that, when it's not even an option, you have to shoot a bow. It's a whole different level.
I think it's pretty cool too, right? Because when you look at it, like, the first record of the Xiongnu is in the 4th century BC, right? And I'm just using them as a reference as nomads, right? They very well could have been doing this for thousands of years prior. And it's likely, again, talking out of my ass, but, you know, given how they were, as Riley said, able to use such immense draw weights on bows while on horseback, not standing there, you know, going like this and having their full body weight into it. Like, it begs the question, is like, these people were like, they molded their physiology to be distinct. Like, they, through generations upon generations upon generations, you'd have to think that they had a greater capacity for strength in their back and whatnot, more stability in their shoulders, etc. Because how else are you able to be that accurate and be that strong while on horseback going 50 or 60 kilometers an hour, right? Like, they literally altered their physiology due to their cultural demands, right?
Absolutely. It would take to learn how to do the level of archery that these guys were doing on horseback would take generations just to figure out how to do it, let alone teach someone how to do it. And that goes into my next point about the Huns. And this is something that we'll really cover next week when we talk more in detail about their actual military campaigns. If you guys are getting a bit bloodlusty and you want to hear about their military campaigns, we will talk about it, I promise. but it's violence of action. So let's give a more modern example. The Germans pulled off the Blitzkrieg in World War II, right? This was this revolutionary new military tactic. Absolutely, the Blitzkrieg was not a new military tactic. Human beings have been doing this forever, and the Huns are an amazing example of that. As we said earlier, even their permanent camps are easy to move. They're not these distinctly deep built-up structures. They could pick up those things and move them. And they're also used to moving. They don't have to establish long supply lines during their campaigns. They have their supply line with them. They are the supply line. They're what's the word for self-sustaining body, right? They're a self-sustaining unit. So they're able to move through enemy territory to attack and then to attack again at a rate that the Romans and as we'll talk about soon, the other Goths and barbarians that were living in the neighborhood, they'd never seen anything like it. And that's really, really important. And they're all on horseback. They don't have cavalry units. They are a cavalry unit.
Even the infantry were on horseback, which is
that's what I mean. They don't have any
they're,
like distinct cavalry. They're all horseback, like all of them.
Pretty cool note. And again, we'll talk about these two things next week. But one, it was said that they wore heavy leather armor with steel-plated helmets, and what they would do with their leather armor is they would take the fat of animals and heavily grease it. Now, that is really smart if you don't know what that means. And that means that while they're riding around on a battlefield and the Romans are getting soaked and all their underclothes are wet and their boots are filled with water, the water is beating off of their armor. Like they are more water resistant than others, right? And that's, you might think, well, that's silly. That's not, it's just water, right? Well, yeah, you tell me it's just water when you're in a pool of blood and mud and all the other elements of war that come into it, and everybody else is soaking wet and you're just on dry as nice and dry and warm. Like,
yeah, and it's 4 degrees and you're waiting 11 hours for the enemy to attack you.
Yeah.
I promise you, man, I got enough firsthand knowledge of being wet and waiting on a defensive line for days. It's a completely different ball game when you're wet. The wet and the cold are horrible. And that's, I think, another thing to note is the Roman military would be called to action. The Huns were living this life 24/7. They don't have a soft, easy life when they go back to the Hungarian plains. Their life is always like this.
I'm glad you brought that up, because there's an interesting thing that started occurring in actually around this time in the Roman Empire and their militaries, and it's such a stark contrast to how the Huns were so easily able to just dispatch the Romans, and that's that the Roman legions had become soft, right? There was legionnaires who would actually complain to the chain of command, and they wouldn't wear their armor into battle. They would take off their helmets, take off their plating. They would take off their shields because they were undisciplined and it was heavy and it was hot out. And it's like, and then you have these Huns just sitting there in this full leather armor, like either warm or cold. That was how they lived, right? And they were ready to just get after it. Whereas, they like Riley said, they didn't need to convince themselves to be hard. They were hard from the moment they came out of their mothers, right?
Honestly, man, these are hard people.
And the last point I think I want to share, and again, this is going to be expanded upon next week when we talk more about the battles with involving the Huns. And that is, they have been said to, by many different historians, come on like a whirlwind. So as Riley said way earlier in the episodes, they would just appear. Well, they wouldn't just appear. It was that they would cover such great distances and do their business in such an expedient manner that before the Romans could even muster a defense, they had already pillaged half of their countryside and gotten out of Dodge, and they were good to go, right?
Exactly. We were talking about how important that is to their economy. So they were masters at this. This was a Tuesday for the Huns.
And you see this as they begin their foray into Europe. Eastern Europe to be exact. So beginning in 370 AD, it appears in the written record that the Huns, that's when they entered. And where did they enter? Well, they entered by fighting the Alans. And the Alans were another nomadic group composed of Sarmatians, Massagetæ, and Sarkas. Essentially, they were an amalgamation. I know that's like, we've used that word like 8 times this podcast, but of many different nomadic tribes or independent cultures inhabiting what would be modern-day Iran. However, at this point in time, they were not in Iran. They had migrated all the way to Western Europe and ended up in Gaul around the time of the Huns. And the Alans bore many similarities to the Huns in terms of appearance and warfare, but as our ancient sources put it, you said, isn't it Jordanes, right? Not Jordanes?
Yeah,
Jordanes?
Jordanus or something like that.
Jordanus? Okay, so And as Jordanus put it, and I quote, "The Alans were their equals in battle, but unlike them in their civilization, manners, and appearance." So, of course, he's talking about the Huns. So this was another similar nomadic group, which, this kind of lends to the message we've been saying, that these people weren't that different. The difference being, violence of action, the warrior mentality, the ruthlessness for a purpose, not just for wanton destruction, right? So the Alans were the first that the Huns encountered in their foray into Europe in 370 AD. And it was 2 years before they had completely routed the Ostrogoths. Now, the Ostrogoths were the eastern component of the Goths, a Germanic people. The name they knew themselves by, their tribal name, and I'll maybe get into this later, but you could hardly call these people tribal at this point. They were more budding empires. But anyway, what they knew themselves by was the Greuthungi. They were, like I said, they were a budding empire, and they were north of the Black Sea, in and around modern-day Ukraine. And they had actually been a persistent threat. And if anybody knows Roman history, these guys, the Germanic tribes, had been around since Julius Caesar was tearing it up in Gaul, like 400 years before this, 300 years before this. And they had been a persistent threat since then, and a nuisance at that, to the Romans until around 370 AD, where they finally had the misfortune of encountering the Huns, and they kind of went off the record for about 80 years. They kind of just disappeared. The Ostrogoths got displaced from their homeland and their territories, and they migrated west inwards to the Roman Empire. And we'll tell you guys about a little bit more about that after. But yeah, they kind of disappeared from the historical record until, led by King Theodoric the Great in the late 5th and early 6th century, they actually kind of trumped the Romans at this point, and they founded the Gothic kingdom of Italy. So they weren't just barbarians living in huts. These were established civilizations, and they were so easily dismantled by the Huns. Next up, their next meal, or victim, was the Visigoths. And the Visigoths were another collection of Germanic people, the western component of the Goths, and they referred to themselves by their, air quotes, tribal name, the Thervingi. And they had been acknowledged in the Roman historical record as a organization of people, not just loosely organized tribes, as early as the 3rd century AD. And it was at this time as well that they had settled west of the Black Sea in what would have been modern-day Germany or Hungary. So to give you guys a picture, if you know a little bit about geography, you can see the Huns coming from where they are, coming up, taking out the Alans, going east, taking out the Ostrogoths, going further east, and taking out the Visigoths. They're on, nothing can stop them, right? And this is why, as Riley had said earlier, they had this image of the indomitable horde, the scourge of God coming on like a flood. And while not all Visigoths, as we came to know them, were Thervingi, eventually the classification applied to all of those within the domain of the Visigoths, because with a lot of these people, they had such tribal and cultural similarities that, they all kind of melded together eventually. Just a brief note on why there's only the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, the Greuthungi and the, the Thervingi. It's because there were so many different small tribes, but as humans grow and evolve and adapt, and the way we get better is we come together, right? We come together and we form these systems and we form these civilizations. So whereas maybe before 100 years or 200 or 300 years prior, there was 30 different tribes, they realized, hey, we're all kind of the same. Why don't we just unite so we all have a better life, right? And there's another group, which Riley's going to tell you guys about right now.
Yeah, and just a quick note before I head into the next group is when you'll read about history, a lot of the times you'll see Goth as a carpet statement to cover all of these guys: the Alans, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Burgundians, and also these guys, the Vandals. And the Vandals or Lugi, they're another group in Europe at this time, and it's suspected that they were Scandinavian origin. They possessed blonde hair, and they were often taller than their counterparts. And they had come onto the scene in the mid to late 3rd century and remained a threat or presence to the Romans until their dissolution in the early 6th century, which is 300 years. While not as much is known regarding whether or not the Vandals had engaged in direct warfare with the Huns, we know that they definitely partook in the Great Migration, which is what we're talking about this massive push of all these different barbarian groups west. And the Vandals actually ended up going so far west, they went around down to North Africa and into modern-day Tunisia. And
through Spain.
Yeah, well, that's kind of how everyone does it. So they go through Spain down into North Africa. They almost reestablished the Carthage threat of Rome from North Africa, and now we sort of know who the players were and what happened. So I think that hopefully that sort of set the stage for what's going on in Europe at the time, because it's really important to note that if you're sort of just getting into Roman and Hunnic and barbarian history, at this time the Romans are no longer the force that they had once been. They're no longer the major player. Honestly, they're a major player.
Yeah, and so, well, what happened exactly? And, well, what happened is there was all the, the cone-headed, baby-faced horsemen with a massive force, the Huns. They annexed the Alans, like we said, and this was in Gaul, not Iran, to specify, and they began attacking the Germanic tribes, like I said, Ostrogoths first, and then Visigoths. And the Vandals, there's no, like I said, no record of the Vandals actually being in direct conflict, but you can imagine if there's three groups of people, and when I say groups of people, I don't mean like there's like 10 dudes like, hey man, we're going to Rome, right? No, we're talking hundreds of thousands, the Great Migration, right? They're going to get swept up in that as well, right? Because maybe these people come to their territory and settle, and they're like, nah, and then they start moving because, they can't fight, and because the Huns are just breathing down on their necks. But anyway, an interesting fact about the Huns that it dissolves a little bit of the barbarous image of them is that they didn't just destroy everybody who they had subjugated. And that's an important word. The operative word here is subjugation. They just wanted people to be under heel, right? They wanted to be the big kids on the block. They wanted to be in charge. And once they were, well, they would utilize the people. They would give them work, essentially, even though it's not the best work. But there's evidence that both Alan, Ostrogoth, and Visigoth warriors became auxiliaries in the Hun armies. And if you don't know what auxiliaries are, it's basically, hey, we'll pay you. You guys go in first and soften them up. We'll come in afterwards, right?
It's mercenaries. They're mercenaries.
Exactly, right. They're mercenaries, but they're more. It's more of like a deeper connection. It's like a mercenary ally kind of deal, right? But ultimately, they are just mercenaries, as we'll see next episode with the mess that you get between the auxiliaries in Rome and how they go back and forth with fighting each other, Huns included. But anyway. After the Huns had dealt with the Alans and absorbed what they could of them, they had moved on to war with the Ostrogoths. The Goths did not fare well either, and by 372 AD, to give you guys a date, the Ostrogoths had been subjugated, and then the Visigoths also fell, and this actually caused the Visigoths to push into Roman territory. In around 376 AD, they had entered the Roman territory. And maybe, you could speculate and say that the Visigoths put up a bigger fight, considering there was a 4-year gap between them conquering the Ostrogoths and now the Visigoths. Or you could just say that the Huns just took out 2 civilizations and said, you know what, let's just kick it for a while, right? Like, let's relax and feast. But yeah, like we said earlier, I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but the path that they had traveled, it would make sense where the Huns to have originated in Kazakhstan, because you kind of get an arc going north and then west of the places that they would have come from. Interestingly enough, though, the big crux of the Great Migration that some say actually aided into the fall of Rome was that it wasn't just the Visigoths who went into their territory, but literally everybody. Because once you have the Huns coming in from the east, and you have the Romans on the west, and you have all these barbarians in the middle, where do they have to go, right? Maybe some went north, and maybe some snuck through south through Greece. Majority of them went right into Rome, right? And Riley will tell you guys about this in the Eastern Empire, what kind of happened with that.
Yeah, I think it's also an important note. You can see that the Goths and the Visigoths, they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. But one of those hard places was a lot softer. It was clear at this time that Rome was not nearly the same level of strength that the Huns were in. You're talking about invading Rome via forced necessity. Do you know what I mean by that? Like they're invading Rome because they have to, and they're deciding.
No option.
But they're deciding that it's easier for them to go into Rome, and that's less of a threat than it is for them to fight the Huns. And that just proves that the Romans are not nearly as strong as they once were. And now Roman territory, it's no longer like Roman territory. It's sort of like, yeah, we kind of own this area. We claim we own it, but we don't even show up ever, and the people that live there barely identify as Roman. So they're moving into this territory, and I think that that's a great example of the level of downturn that Rome is on at the time. So I'll talk about what happens when they move into this Roman territory. And initially, the Eastern Roman Emperor, and Rome has two emperors at this point, Valens, he allows the Goths, specifically the Visigoths and the Therfungi, to settle in Rome. And I don't mean like Rome proper, but it's in Thrace, which is southeastern Europe, which would be modern-day Greece, Bulgaria, and a little bit of Turkey as well. And Valens and the Goths, they'd created this uneasy, quote-unquote, alliance. And the Romans were providing them this sanctuary, and the Goths provided the Romans with soldiers, which was a pretty consistent deal among Roman empires. But unfortunately, Valens, he didn't give the Goths enough land or resources to sustain themselves. So food shortages quickly led to rebellions between the Goths and the Romans. So this culminated in the First Gothic War, which many point to as a pivotal moment in the decline of the Roman Empire. Now, interestingly enough, during the First Gothic War in 378 AD at Adrianople, it is said that the primary antagonist were the Therfungi, or Visigoths, as we said earlier, and a combined forces with the Ostrogoths and Huns had aided in the defeat and death of Valens on that day.
That's pretty spectacular when you think of it, because, as we're talking about the sandwich, and, one side's soft and the other side's a rock, so you're obviously going to try to go through the piece of bread. The way it occurred was the Huns essentially walked in, kicked the Alans, Visigoths, and Ostrogoths out of their territory. The Visigoths got pushed south to fight the Romans, or to, I guess, be settled by the Romans. Settled, basically just, yeah, stay over there, stay quiet, right? We'll deal with you guys later, while they're starving to death. And so the Visigoths rebel, which led to the First Gothic War. But the interesting thing about this is, and this speaks to, it's an interesting element of the Goths, and it kind of gets cleared up when Attila comes onto the scene. But while they were led primarily by kings and they had leaders, they still had independent tribes and independent units, right? That mercenaries, right? That could have gone off just to get paid. And that's exactly what happened at Adrianople. While the Thervingi were fighting the Romans, or waiting to fight the Romans, they had a relief force coming of Greuthungi and Huns. So the Huns kicked these guys out of their territory, made them go fight Rome. And they're like, hey man, that's sucks what's going on down there. Do you guys need a hand? Because if you can pay, maybe we'll, we're pretty good at this warfare stuff, right? So they came down, they gave the Visigoths a hand, and then, they won the day at Adrianople, and that it signifies the shift of power in the world at this time, right? Like, it was no longer the one centralized empire that maybe stretched a little too far. It was all these different players that came on the scene that were capable. And now that we've introduced you guys to the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Alans, and the Vandals, it needs to be said, and this is more Roman related than it is Hun, but it is still relevant given what occurred, is that maybe by interacting with the Romans, these groups of uncivilized barbarians that were, mind you, so easily dealt with 100 years prior, they had become more Rome-like in the best ways, right? Or the worst ways, if you think warfare is the worst ways. And they developed new strategies, better tactics, more different methods of warfare. And that all kind of culminated here, right? But still, even though they were like the Romans, they were still incredibly insufficient when it came to the powerhouse that was the Huns. And you see that with what the Huns did to Rome.
Yeah, you also see that it's obviously not personal to the Huns. Their invasions of the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, they literally invade these guys, kick their butts, and then show up and they're like, hey, yeah, no, we'll roll with you. It's not personal. They're doing this as a means of economic success. They've got a tool, and that's the tool of whoop ass, and they use it. And they use it their entire existence. And during this time, they start to make their own incursions against Rome. And they develop this weird relationship with the Romans. And the Huns, in my opinion, they have weird relationships with everyone throughout their entire existence, because it's on very rare occasions do they decide, this is my enemy and I will attack until you're destroyed. They sort of just like milk people for their cash and keep them alive.
Sorry to cut you off, but to be fair, I feel like that's a lot of these civilizations, though, right? Like, it's like a thing to remember is it's not like it's not like Canada or the United States in the modern day where, we the people elect the person in charge of us so we can, to some degree steer what happens with our country. Because you might have, and we'll get into this next episode, you might have Stilicho being the general of Rome who's beating back the barbarians, but you have an ambitious man in Aetius Flavius who decides, you know what, I want that position, but maybe he's not as competent, so he arranges to have Stilicho killed. Right. So where you have, and maybe with the death of that previous general, that maybe the poor relationship that Rome had with that invading force wasn't necessarily a problem with Rome as much as it was with the problem that was in charge of Rome. Right. So once that man was eliminated, well, the Huns are like, all right, we'll do business. Let's get after it. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And they arrange this and we're going back a bit from what Ashton just brought us to, because that's next episode. But during this time, where the Great Migration has begun, the Romans and the Huns they develop an almost amicable relationship, and the Romans are consistently using the Huns as mercenaries and not auxiliaries. They're using them as mercenaries in this sense, and they're paying them handsomely, and they're also allowing them to keep any of the spoils of war, and they've been using the Huns as this great tool for their own military excursions, let's say. And they also, this is where they start paying the Huns this yearly tribute of about 350 pounds of gold to not attack them. It's almost like the mafia have showed up at their doorstep and they're paying them their security deposit every year. And they're actually paying this. So the Huns take this opportunity to try other areas of invasion, and they actually completely leave Rome for a little bit, go all the way to Armenia, and they focus their attention towards the Sassanids, and expand on that a little bit.
We don't know as much as there is. What we do know is that the Huns, they pushed the Sassanids. They actually got close to the capital, but there was a deciding victory. And, the Huns weren't used to defeat. So when they get an astounding defeat dealt to them, they kind of turn tail and run, right? And worthwhile to say, going back just a moment to what Riley was mentioning about this weird relationship the Romans and the Huns had, like I said earlier, and you saw this with the groups of barbarians, I'm not going to list their names because I've done it 8 times. Once they were, again, operative word, subjugated, they were all good, right? So from the Huns, they got to realize, we're getting paid right now. In their mind, they know the Romans wouldn't be paying them if the Romans could handle them, right? So for all intents and purposes, the Romans are subjugated, right? There's no need for the Huns to have to fight them, right? But this time away where the Huns went to fight the Sassanids, they... Again, like I mentioned, ambitious men in Rome, that goes hand in hand, and women. Women pulled the strings quite often, actually. It created an uneasy relationship between Rome and the Huns because you have one individual who might come into power in one area where the Huns previously had subjugated, who says, you know what, we can handle these guys. So they start, having machinations and plans and trying to undermine the previous agreement. And, when the Huns come back from their other campaign and they're like, wait a minute, so you guys aren't paying us what you're paying us. Now you've moved over here and now you're trying to fight us over here. And all these things are occurring at once. It kind of, it embitters the relationship. And at a point, it seemingly was past the point of amicability, right?
Yeah. And just to note about the Sassanids is it goes back to the Huns don't usually invade for egotistical gain until we see Attila. Before that, it's almost strictly for monetary gain. So when they lose a battle, they're not gonna egotistically come back and be like, no, we can kick ass, we can beat you. Maybe they could have, but realistically, that conquest ended when they realized that it wasn't worth it to them anymore. It cost them too much in life and in resources to continue on. But something I think is crazy, just to give you an idea. Armenia and Greece are not close to each other. And that's the size of the Hunnic Empire, or at least the area of mobility where the Huns will go completely unchallenged. So that's really important. So overall, this alliance between the Huns and the Romans, which is a stretch to say at the least, in reality, it's a very uneasy relationship, is because they're both routinely breaking this agreement they have. And it doesn't take long for the Huns to get a taste of Roman gold. And not to mention Roman wine. It's actually noted that they probably were not drinking wine at all until they came into contact with the Romans, and they get a taste for it. And the Huns like to party. And this is where it all starts to fall apart. This amicable relationship slowly deteriorates.
So yeah, this beneficial relationship that was mutually beneficial, it expanded from a useful mercenary force to a thirsty powerhouse sitting right on the Roman border, waiting to get another opportunity at Roman gold. They were, like I said, subjugated. They knew that all they had to do was, it's like a vending machine, right? But instead of putting a coin in, you press a button and a coin comes out. And for now, we are actually nearing the end of what there is to say about the Huns. But before we get there, just to say one last thing, it wasn't just gold. It wasn't just through brutality they would get it. They would get it through extortion or tribute or employment. So it wasn't just like they would still work for the Romans, but maybe the price was a little bit higher. But I'm going to let Riley close us out with a quote that really sets the stage for the next episode and gives you an idea of the position that the Romans were in. And not just the Romans, but anybody that had to deal with the Huns at this point in history.
Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, deplored the situation with these words: "They have become both masters and slaves of the Romans." I'm Riley Osborne. This is my co-host, Ashton Myers. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. This was an introductory episode to Attila the Hun, which is next week's episode. We hope to have painted a pretty good picture of for you about what was going on in the time, who the Huns really were, and that will make next week's episode a little bit more exciting and a little bit more liberal in what we get to talk about. I feel good ending there, man.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you for listening, guys. Riley will, because I cannot remember for the life of me all of the different channels that we need to promote, my good friend will let you guys know again how you can support the podcast, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. And if you're a new listener, or even if you're a current listener, and maybe you've listened to the 3 episodes we've released and you're a fan of it, please, not only on social medias, but share it with your friends, share it with your family. We're just 2 dudes that love history and love telling a story as best as we can, and we want to get better, and we want to spread that with as many people as possible. We want to try to positively affect the outlook and the critical thinking abilities of people out there surrounding history. So please, I implore you, if you wish to join our community, we will welcome you with open arms, just like the Huns would when they'd subjugated their foes.
Yeah, man. We really want to make a community of history lovers. We want this to be a bit more of a laid back way of going through history. We don't want to make a community of people that's going to be negative and attack people about history. We all want to learn. That's why I'm here. That's why I get so motivated to make these episodes. Every week I get to dive into research that maybe I haven't done too much of before. And it's just a great opportunity. So if you want to be part of this, if you want to support us, a couple ways to support us are to go and follow us on social media at Human Histories Podcast. We also have a Patreon. And on Patreon, we offer some things like we offer the transcripts for the episodes. This one was 8 pages. So there's a lot of great information there that you can go reference if you want to read. We also have Q&As that we'll do on the Patreon. And that's just a great way to allow us to get a bit more time to reinvest into the podcast. And also email us at humanhistoriespodcast@gmail.com. And that's kind of it. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. We enjoyed making it. And we hope to see you guys next week. And if you're new, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, guys.
Have a great day or night.